Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to continue to talk about human information behavior as we started to last week in a continuation from last week. And I just want to go over some points from the articles that I've assigned you to read this week. Cooper is talking about design of interfaces when designing them for children and things that need to be taken into consideration when both designing interfaces and teaching students how to use these interfaces. So we're kind of narrowing down from overall human information behavior in this case to human information behavior and information seeking for children who have different needs because of their developmental and cognitive states as they grow up. So obviously a kindergartner is going to have different needs when they're looking for information than somebody in 5th grade, than somebody in 9th grade, than somebody in 12th grade. So one of the things to think about is the fact that most students are what they call digitally native now and have been for a while. And supposedly this gives them some extra ability to use technology, which it certainly does, but sometimes I think that's overestimated in terms of what they do know how to use and what they are not sophisticated enough to know how to use or haven't been taught how to use. So you can't just expect somebody who's digitally native and knows how to use a cell phone to be able to pick up and seamlessly use a database or search engines without any kind of teaching and without any instruction. Other things to think about too with digitally native is that not everybody has computers at home or is able to access broadband internet. So if they are using computers at home, it may be very slow, or they may be homeless. So there's definitely still a digital divide. While mobile phones have penetrated pretty far into, there's less of a digital divide with mobile phones, they are not as robust a platform for using some of these resources as a laptop or a desktop would be. Even a tablet sometimes is less user-friendly and shows less of the interface than a laptop or a desktop would. So those are some things to think about when you're thinking about how students of all ages use technology. And of course, students of different stages of cognitive ability and social ability will use digital interfaces differently. And Cooper is particularly talking about digital interfaces, although we could expand this to think about interfaces, print interfaces, which are also developed, follow certain conventions such as a reference book with a table of contents and an index, and students need to be taught to use that technology. And some of the books that you indicated in our fall discussion where we shared books from the fall have that interface in a simpler way. So you'll see certain books that have a glossary or have a table of contents where it's only maybe 3 lines, and have an index where it's only maybe 4 or 6 things in the index, but it's a way to get students to be able to use the interface of the print material get them using it young so that they continue to use it as they're older. And we'll look a little bit at different stages of digital interfaces also. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. But I do want to indicate or talk about the cultural influences also on interfaces, where the youngest students may be given interfaces where they're just clicking on a picture. So if they want information about a bird, they click on a robin. But there's a question about whether a robin might be the best example of a bird. What does that mean, a bird, to everyone? Maybe by the shore it's a seagull, or in Arizona it's a quail, or maybe in South America, somebody from South America, a robin's not colorful enough to be recognized as a bird. So there's also cultural influences and cultural influences that will affect how children of different ages and different backgrounds use all kinds of interfaces. There's also visual literacy that needs to be taught. Not everybody can interpret images. Part of it could be cultural, but interpreting visual images is a learned and culturally dependent skill, and everybody people might come at a visual item differently depending on what they've learned and what their experiences are, as in the example of the robin. So it could be just younger children need help interpreting pictures and reading them, or there's because of cultural influences, because they haven't had practice, because they're not exposed to a lot of pictures. You know, if you're in a household where all of your images move, then maybe a static image, because you're watching TV, maybe a static image in a book doesn't make as much sense to you. I also think Cooper makes a good point when she talks about there being no one best medium. There can be excellent print material that's not appropriate for all children, and excellent digital material that's not appropriate for all children. And it depends on the child, on their developmental stage, on the task, what you're trying to do with it, how much experience they've had. There's a lot of things that go into picking the right material for a child to use. The other thing is understanding that a technology is a tool, not just a problem, throwing tech at a problem. I'm sure you've seen this and been driven crazy by this, but just because you have a problem doesn't mean technology is going to solve it. Technology has to be thought about very carefully, how it's going to be used to make more effective and efficient process, to make a more effective and efficient process, not just, oh, this is cool technology, let's use it. And of course the tools have to be developmentally appropriate. For example, Searchosaurus uses pictures, which should be easier for students to click through and choose what they want in order to find more information. But I think here is where visual literacy and cultural baggage comes in also, because, you know, would you think this might just be about Thanksgiving? If you can't read the word history, I would say, oh, I want information about Thanksgiving, I'll go there. Maybe culturally a child there's some religions that don't take children to see doctors, so they might not understand what the white coat means. So even with this simple of an interface, there could be issues that students need practice in order to use correctly. And I see in Cooper's article an argument for having students in the library learning how to use it from the time they're very young, in its different aspects, in order to continue building on past experience as they progress developmentally. And when we're comparing interfaces, this is certainly a much more difficult interface to use that you wouldn't give to a kindergartner or first grader. So being aware of these design issues can help you evaluate and choose developmentally appropriate databases for using with students. The The other article I've given you to read is Shelton, and he indicates, he goes through a variety of paradoxes, which I think are very interesting to think about. This first paradox is the effect of a library's procedures with regard to users' attitudes and behavior are frequently inconsistent with the organization's aims. There's been a lot of conversation in the last 18 months or so about fines, and if fines, library fines, are the best way to proceed, because you're basically penalizing and leaving the people who most need the library because they a lack of money, a lack of other resources, out in the cold. Basically, they're shut out if the fines don't let them use the library. If a student with no ability to control what happens at home and has no can't control what happens at home and can't bring the book back on time, is a fine the best way to proceed. There's been some interesting things talking about reading fines off. It is hard to lose a book when a student doesn't return it, but if they have no control over what happens at home and who takes the book from them at home, how is the best way to address it? Is it by not letting them ever take a book out again? We need to think about things like that. Also, in public libraries, you often have a 30-minute limit on computers, cost for printing, library cards to access databases, and these are all things that can work against the aim of serving the public, and for a school library, having students become lifelong learners and lifelong readers. His second paradox is that in order to access information as source, the user must often apply knowledge that he or she does not yet possess. And this knowledge could be domain knowledge and vocabulary. If you think about what we said last week, that sometimes you don't know where to start a search because you don't know the vocabulary that's used in that particular subject area. So you might have to start a search with simple vocabulary, maybe go to Wikipedia, because as you guys saw from comparing Wikipedia and other encyclopedias, sometimes it's a good place to start, and it gives you maybe too much information, but maybe what you need in order to expand your vocabulary. Also, they must apply knowledge in terms of using databases that they may not possess. So not only do they not have the vocabulary to look up and do research, they don't know how to use the database. So this is something to keep in mind when you're sitting students down to have them start to do research. I think paradox 3 is really interesting. Young people are often highly critical of particular information resources, yet continue to use them habitually. They know when they Google that they may not be getting the best answers, but they don't know how else to find answers. So they continue to use Google because it's their go-to. They would probably be more satisfied with results from a database, but they lack the skill and the knowledge or the access to the database in order to go and find better information. Sometimes they can turn to a person to find information, but we want to try to get them to understand that there's something besides Google and learn how to use it. Also, despite the sophistication of today's information age, again, we have these digital natives that we think are sophisticated in use of technology. Youngsters frequently follow a basic formula for action when finding and using information. They Google it, they find something that's probably not completely satisfying, they cut and paste it into the report. Nothing really goes, as she said, nothing really passes through their brain. So they're not taking the knowledge plus info and creating new knowledge that needs to be done. And this is something that needs to be, students need help with. It's not a skill that they possess naturally. By not passing it through their brains, they're not building new knowledge. Both of these paradoxes can be part of your advocacy toolbox, in that it can be a way to explain why a school librarian is needed. Need to teach students how to use and judge information sources, how to go beyond that feeling that Google's not giving them what they want, and teach them to find something else. While an individual trained in technology who might be able to get people through searching, they're not trained to teach students how to differentiate necessarily, and they're not necessarily trained to taught to how to construct searches and evaluate websites or other reference sources. And they don't understand that at different ages, students need different strategies to break out of this basic formula for finding and using information. Even, I think, kindergartners, when using doing research on something as simple as an animal, could be they're going to go and find a book and basically write down something from the book. That's a good basis, but maybe you can find two things that they learn, that they have to not depend on just one source for information, and begin to be more sophisticated about and critical of their sources. 4 and 5, verification of information in sources is widely advocated, but strategies for implementing this process may be of questionable value. We talked about different ways that you can teach your students to evaluate websites, such as CRAP, which I know a lot of you did not like the name, especially for younger students, and the 5 W's, and the other Rain. I'm blanking on it now. But unless this is practiced and practiced and practiced, it still doesn't become second nature for students to verify information. And this is why you see students sharing fake knowledge, fake news, and unverified websites, and things being passed around that are of questionable value. And perhaps the emphasis on fake news and on combating fake news is actually a good thing at this time, in some ways, not in all ways, but because it's something that's being talked about more, they're aware of more, and maybe more research will be done on what are really good ways of getting of implementing verification of information in sources. And you know, maybe eventually they will learn. My sister-in-law and mother-in-law used to pass along news stories to me, or pictures and stuff, and because I'm so familiar with this, I'd look at it and I'd say, this doesn't feel right, and I'd go on to Snopes.com and look it up, and of course it was false, or constructed falsely, or combined things that were false, and I'd write back to them saying, yes, but if you look here, it's not true. And they've given up on sending me things, and I'm hoping it's because they've learned to be more discerning. I have not actually asked that question. They might have just gotten tired of me telling them, nope, that's not true. Nobody likes a smart ass, but I can't help it when somebody sends me stuff that's obviously fake or false. So paradox 6 is the idea of linear rather than iterative and dynamic research. As we said, the research process, I said last lecture, that the research process is iterative. One class session is not sufficient for research, because students need to interpret their results, look for new information, they're going to increase their understanding, they're going to learn that domain language, and then they need to come back and look for additional, do additional research to really build a knowledge base and get their brain engaged to develop new knowledge. And this also is where having perhaps kindergartners not just pick out the first book on whales that they see, but understand that you need to further explore the questions that are raised by your original research. And somebody who is passionate about a topic might go off and be able to find, will be engaged enough to do this. But if somebody's just filling in just doing a project because they have to, probably it's going to be harder without nudging and without teaching them that one search is not sufficient, that you often have to go do searches over and over again in order to get complete information and understand your topic better and find additional lines of inquiry that will send you back to another search. I think Paradox 7 is pretty funny because I don't think this is going to ever happen in a school. He posits that library goers, if they reduce their reliance on the information professional helping patrons do research, then patrons won't understand what information, librarians won't understand what patrons are searching for because they won't be helping them. So in other words, your patrons, your students understand how to do research so well that they never come to you for help, and therefore you don't know what they're looking for. I think that school librarians would be lucky to spend enough quality time helping students do research to get to this point, and I just don't think that it's going to happen. And I think that as students develop, particularly say year to year, there's new things to teach them about databases. As some of you saw from your deep dive into a single database, there's some interesting things. I think it was Michael that talked about in something about the author, the term frequency thing that you can do to see how often a term is found in a search results. So that's something that you can go on to teach somebody later on. That's not something you're going to use, the first thing you're going to use this library database for, but perhaps at some point in the future that will be something that you can use. And that's, as students develop, they're going to develop some skills and need reinforcement in some skills and need other skills to be developed that they haven't yet really used. As we saw in our examples, going from just clicking on pictures to typing in what you need. And then we can go from a basic question on Google to some of the searches that we've learned this semester. So there's a lot of ways that you can continue, if you're lucky enough to get the time, that you can continue to teach your students and find out what their information needs are. You also have a built-in way to find out information needs if you are able to have your teachers talk to you about what their projects and curriculum are going to be. It won't be you won't be finding out what students are exploring for their own interests, perhaps, but you will be, hopefully, if you can understand, have some advance notice about curriculum, which I know is not easy, and I think I've identified it as an issue in if not this course, in another course, that getting teachers to tell you before they walk in the door that they need biographies of women scientists, and don't, if it's not something that's as easy to find, and you need to be prepared. Hopefully, if you've got money, you can add those to your library, but you're not going to add them to them in the 1 week or 2 weeks that students have to read the book and write the report or whatever it's going to be. You're just not going to, being taken by surprise is never a fun thing when it comes to having resources for students. So good, have fun. I hope you got something, have fun reading this week's literature and articles. I hope you get something out of it. Again, I don't expect you to understand every single word, but I do expect you to try to get something out of the articles and think a little bit more about the points I've made here. So I'll see you on the discussion board. Thanks.